Welcome to the world of hazardous waste. Over the next 2 weeks, we will dive into just the basics of hazardous waste and what makes something hazardous. This week is just an introduction to hazardous waste. You can think of it as a scratch in the ground. The objectives of this week are to describe major legislation governing hazardous waste management, as well as define and identify hazardous wastes. This picture is of an illegal dump site that contains CRT glass. Did you ever have a TV, the big box TV, that had this CRT glass? Each state is regulated under the EPA, and some states have state-specific regulations. Since World War II, new technologies have been developed at a rocketing pace. Almost every household in our society has become accustomed to the daily use of manufactured products and chemicals that offer us to what seems to be an increased convenience and efficiency, something that could eventually be a hazardous waste. Many of these products are made from materials that don't naturally exist in the world. This means that it requires careful handling during the manufacturing, transport, storage, and use to avoid causing harm to human health and the environment. What governs this hazardous waste? In 1965, Congress passed the Solid Waste Disposal Act. This was the first federal law that required safeguards and encouraged environmentally sound methods for disposal of hazardous, municipal, commercial, and industrial wastes. Congress amended this law in 1970 by passing the Resource Recovery Act. And again, they further protected the environment by passing in 1976 the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also known as RCRA. The majority of hazardous waste regulations are derived from this. Some chemicals, like PCBs and asbestos, are regulated under the Toxic Substance Control Act. All of these laws are federally mandated. They're coded in the federal regulations known as CFR. What are the goals of RCRA? First and foremost, it is to protect human health and the environment from potential hazards of waste disposal. Next is to conserve energy and natural resources. Third, it is to reduce the amount of waste generated, including hazardous wastes. And lastly, to ensure that these wastes are managed in an environmentally sound manner. As knowledge about health impacts as well as environmental impacts of waste disposal increased, Congress revised RCRA first in 1980 and again in 1984. These amendments are known as the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments. They established a system to control hazardous waste, toxic substances, as well as petroleum products stored in underground storage tanks. Problems associated with the mismanagement of hazardous waste are covered by RCRA's companion laws, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. This is also known as CERCLA. It mainly applies to Superfund sites. Do you know of any Superfund sites in Colorado? CERCLA addresses the cleanup of inactive and abandoned hazardous waste sites. So who is regulated? This is a very, very important slide. It is important to note that households and residents are not regulated under RCRA. While each state can encourage residents who generate household hazardous waste to dispose of them in a safe manner, they are not regulated. Facilities who are regulated include generators of hazardous waste, transporters, and hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, also known as TSDFs. Further regulations are under state laws. There are some states that are authorized, as well as some states that are non-authorized. Previously, before coming back to school, I was working in Arizona, who had a specific law that they could not be more or less stringent than the EPA. Some EPA authorized states, like California and Colorado, are able to set their own statutes and regulations to further protect human health and the environment. For Colorado, these regulations fall under the statutes known as Colorado Revised Statutes or regulations under the Code of Colorado Regulations. All of this is in lieu of RCRA. Here are some specific parts to these regulations that Colorado has, like Section 262, which applies specifically to generators, or 264, which applies to permitted treatment, storage, disposal facilities. Here are some more Colorado-specific regulations. I want to point out Section 273, which applies to universal wastes, which we will cover later in this lecture. RCRA regulates hazardous waste from point of generation until ultimate disposal. This is known as the cradle-to-grave system. The cradle is hazardous waste generation. Next is transportation of this hazardous waste. This can occur through air, rail, roadway, and waterways. Lastly is TSDFs, and they cover the treatment, disposal, and eventually, if possible, recycling of this waste. What makes a waste hazardous? These next 4 questions are what someone uses to determine if a waste is hazardous. This picture on the left I found when doing a hazardous waste inspection. Do you think those materials are hazardous wastes? Properties that make it dangerous or capable of harmful effects on human health or the environment is a hazardous waste. Hazardous wastes come in all shapes and forms. They can be liquid, gas, sludge, and even solids. They can be the byproduct of manufacturing processes or simply excess commercial products. There is a schematic that will help you work through what hazardous waste determination is. As we can see, the four main questions that lead to hazardous wastes being regulated. First is a solid waste. This can be any garbage, refuse, sludge, or other discarded material, including solid, liquid, semi-solid, or contained gaseous material resulting from industrial, commercial, mining, and agricultural operations. Discarded material means abandoned, recycled, inherently waste-like, as well as military munitions, my favorite. So we covered what is a solid waste. Next, is it excluded from the waste definition? Some exclusions are found in Colorado Code of Regulations, Section 261.4. These exclusions include domestic sewage, household waste, discharges under the Clean Water Act, scrap metal, coal combustion waste, exploration and production wastes, as well as some mining wastes. Next, are they listed or characteristic hazardous wastes? For specific waste determination, we will cover four categories: characteristic or D listed, listed under F, K, P, and U, the mixture rule, and derived from rule. Four categories of hazardous waste characteristics include ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. This picture on the right was taken from a hazardous waste inspection that included, this is hexavalent chromium spillage that can seep through this concrete floor. First is ignitable waste. This can be any material displaying the following characteristics: a liquid with a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This can include solvents, mineral spirits, as well as paints. Solids that can readily ignite and burn vigorously from friction, absorption of moisture, or even spontaneously catch fire. The picture on the right was a situation where emergency control must happen when a container spontaneously combusts. Other ignitable hazardous waste characteristics are ignitable compressed gases, or DOT oxidizers. For corrosivity, it is materials displaying the following characteristics. For liquid wastes, it is anything that corrodes steel at a rate of more than 0.25 inches per year. This can be determined through a paint filter test or even a copper or ferric chloride for metal etching. This picture was taken from another hazardous waste inspection where you can see this container had been corroded and was now leaking hazardous waste into the soil. For reactivity, this means that it reacts with air, water, or other substances, resulting in fire, explosion, or toxic gases. Materials displaying these following characteristics can be categorized as reactive. They are normally unstable and readily undergo violent changes without denotation. They react violently to water. They form potentially explosive mixtures. Or when mixed with water, they generate toxic gases, vapors, or fumes. What do you think happened in this picture? That was a fun inspection. Lastly is toxicity. Concentration in leachate from the toxic characteristic leaching procedure determines the level of toxicity a waste is. It contains one or more of the 8 regulated metals or 32 organic compounds higher than the regulatory levels. Again, this picture is from that same waste inspection where hexavalent chromium was found spilled in this makeshift containment area. It's important to note that hexavalent chromium can cause cancer by targeting the respiratory system, kidneys, liver, skin, and even eyes. Next is listed hazardous wastes. This is based on historical use, background, and derived wastes. The 4 types are F, or non-specific sources, K, specific sources, P, acute hazardous waste, and U, toxic hazardous wastes. A material can be more than just one of these 4 types. First is F-listed wastes. It can be a spent solid or an F1 through 5. Wastes from electroplating or other metal finishing operations. This is 6 through 12, as well as F19. Wastes from the production of certain chlorinated hydrocarbons under F24 and 25. Wood preservation under 32, 34, and 35. The picture on the right was another inspection at a metal plating facility. They thought this plastic bucket was a good enough container to hold this F-listed waste. Specifically for spent solvent wastes, or F1 through 5, the following criteria must be met. They're specified before use concentration. They're used as a solvent for cleaning or degreasing, and then they are spent or used. This requires a facility to have knowledge of this process that leads to the creation of wastes. Further, spent solvents have different examples associated with them, like methylene chloride, toluene, methyl ethyl ketone, or other ingredients that are not listed as a waste. The picture on the right is that same metal plating facility. What do you think is wrong with this picture? And what is the potential impact on the environment from this facility? Next is K listed. This can include wood preservation, inorganic and organic manufacturing, pesticides, explosives, petroleum, iron and steel production, or even primary copper production. Remember when I said explosives were my favorite? The picture on the right was when I was doing a landfill closure assessment where we had to dig exploratory pits to ensure that the landfill was properly made. One day we dug up these discarded munitions. On the left, those are specifically for a tank. Every 6th or 8th one is not a bullet, but a laser. Think of Star Wars. The canister on the right is actually for mustard gas. Yes, they threw this just in a landfill and ignored everything. We had to shut down the site after we found these materials. More K-listed wastes from specific sources include lead, zinc, or aluminum production. It can include vet pharmaceutical manufacturing, as well as ink formulation. What do you think the waste is in this picture? Next is P-wastes from discarded commercial chemical products. They can be acutely toxic, discarded commercial products, off-specification products, as well as spills. This picture was from a different hazardous waste inspection where they had spilled all of this material in what they thought was an appropriate catchment area. What do you think was wrong with this? Lastly is U-listed waste from discarded products. This can be container residues and spill residues. This picture was what was pulled off of that truck in a previous picture, and we had to figure out how to first stop it from being on fire, and lastly then what to do with this soil now that it's spilled. So we went through characteristic and listed wastes. Next, is it a mixture or derived from? First is mixture. It's any listed waste mixed with anything else that makes it a listed waste. It can be a characteristic waste mixed with anything, and that makes it a characteristic waste if the mixture takes on that characteristic. Mixing equals treatment. Land disposal restrictions may still be applicable and require a permit. What is the derived from rule? This is any waste generated from the TSDF of a listed hazardous waste. This can be sludge, spill residue, ash, emission dust control, leachate, or even solvent distillation pucks. Further, it is any waste generated during the treatment, storage, or disposal until it no longer displays any characteristic. This picture was from an inspection we did, and they thought they were correctly treating their hazardous wastes and then throwing it into a dumpster. What do you think is wrong with this? Next is contaminated media and debris through the contained in policy. Contaminated environmental media, this can be soil, groundwater, sod, etc., as well as the debris like PPE or sampling equipment, are dealt within the regulations differently than the mixture of this hazardous waste. There are specific distinctions for both contaminated media and debris that are important because some situations allow for management of mixtures with this listed waste as non-hazardous. Environmental media are not themselves solid wastes, so they cannot be hazardous wastes, but they can contain hazardous wastes. That is very important to remember. I'll repeat. Environmental media are not themselves solid wastes, so they can't be hazardous wastes, but they can contain hazardous waste. When environmental media contain this listed hazardous waste or contain enough hazardous constituents to exhibit a hazardous waste characteristic, they must be managed as a hazardous waste until it is a no longer threat defined with RCRA. Debris is a solid waste and therefore is a solid hazardous waste. It can be contaminated with any listed hazardous waste, or it contains sufficient hazardous wastes to exhibit a characteristic. This picture is our eventual cleanup of that soil that there wasn't a waste itself, but it contained spill residue and therefore had to be treated as a hazardous waste. Lastly, what wastes are we forgetting? Well, that is universal wastes. There are 4, soon to be 5 types of universal waste that no matter the facility, no matter the generator status, which we will learn about next week, they are universal waste and have specific ways to be stored and transported. This can include batteries, pesticides, lamps, mercury-containing equipment, and aerosols. The asterisk next to aerosols is because that is the waste that is under review to be moved from hazardous waste to a universal waste.